Welcome, everyone, to the Rise Above Heartless Materialism podcast. I am your host, Aaron Kessler. I'm a filmmaker, colorist, and I just dabble in other related things as well. One of the things that really helps me in my creative artistic work, but also just in life in general, is the different personality systems, Myers-Briggs, four temperaments, the Big Five. And today, my guest is Father Evan Winter. He's a good friend of mine, a priest from the Diocese of Lincoln, which is a great diocese. There's a lot of good things going on, a lot of good culture. Father Evan is a musician, well, a composer. He's a composer, and he also is a writer as well in his spare time. But Father Evan Winter actually was the one who first taught me about the cognitive functions behind Myers-Briggs. So I am very excited to have him today. And today we're going to talk about Myers-Briggs and personalities and just how human beings are human beings and not machines, which we all love technology and such, but in our technological age, sometimes we forget that we're all humans. So without further ado, Father Evan Winter.
Do I need to work on my lighting? Is my forehead blinding people and then my face shrouded in darkness?
A little bit. I wouldn't say it's a huge problem, but
I just have on this one little overhead light. Let me try. I need some more. There we go.
well, it's certainly brighter. It's
Is it?
it's a little washed out, but
How's
there you
that?
go. That is much better lighting.
There we go. Great.
There is a sense of three-dimensionality to your appearance. That's what you want with lighting. So cool.
Mhm.
So, my first question to you is, do you think that many people assume, whether knowingly or unknowingly, that everyone is generally alike?
Yeah, I think assume is doing a lot of lifting here. I do think that there's a kind of natural disposition that we have to think that other people are going to be like ourselves. I also think that a lot of people in a lot of situations do a very good job of getting past that initial reaction.
Mm.
Like, is it an initial reaction? Sure. Have I myself many times made that mistake? Absolutely. Are there many, many other times when I think people are kind of, they accustom themselves to the idea of people aren't like me and I need to work with that and appreciate that. I do think that there's a lot of people who are pretty good at that. I think maybe there's areas in which it's stronger than others, areas in which it's weaker than others. But yeah, I'd say as a base assumption, yeah, pretty common in human nature, but one that we as human beings, if we have even a little bit of wisdom, outgrow pretty quickly.
Right. But I think it's an easy tendency or an easy thing to fall into, because we have so much more information on ourselves than we do other people. So it saves carbohydrates to just assume that, oh, well, this person acts just like me because that's where all my data comes from, is my own experience. So let's just project that onto somebody else, and save energy and time and all that sort of thing. But
it only saves energy and time in the short run, as you're very well aware.
right. In the long term, it creates severe complications. Absolutely. So on the other hand, why do you think some people resist personality classification? I'm sure you've ran into those people on the internet or in real life who are just like, I don't want to put a box on me. I'm just too unique, kind of thing.
Sure. So I think, so there's several reasons why people might resist personality classifications. One of them is exactly the one that you're describing. I don't want to be put in a box. We can go into there's actually some interesting metaphysics, for lack of a better word, behind whether or not these boxes are a good idea or not, that I would be more than happy to get into and really get into the weeds there. So maybe we'll come back to that one. But other than that, I would say there's several other reasons why people might resist personality classification. So the first one is that the tests for personality classification are notoriously unreliable. And this is true kind of across the board. My understanding is that really the only personality system that has a reliable test associated with it is the Big Five, which is not our topic of conversation today, but that's the only thing that's remotely close to being scientific. Any kind of other personality test is going to give you different results depending on your mood for the day. And so some people don't make that distinction, right? They realize the tests are terrible, and so they decide to throw out the classifications along with them. And the naming conventions don't really help you with that, right? Because we call the Myers-Briggs personality things, we call them the MBTI, which is short for Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, which technically refers to the test and not the personality system. And so like all these people are saying, well, MBTI personality system. It's like, no, MBTI is literally the test, which is terrible. Okay. So that's another reason why people might resist personality classification. And I would say other reasons have to do with complaints that are like specific to specific personality tests. So my therapist, for example, she's going to kill me for this. She doesn't like the Myers-Briggs because of reasons that are particular to the Myers-Briggs. She likes the 4 temperaments. She likes certain other ones, but she has a specific dislike of the Myers-Briggs, which is unfortunate. I think she and I will we might have to revisit that, but we're agreeing to disagree for the time being. Anyway, so that's so like for example, I have particular complaints against the Enneagram. I recently wrote a article for our diocesan newspaper about how it's not a sin to take the Enneagram's test or to investigate it. But I have serious personal issues against the system. I don't think it makes sense. I don't think there's anything sinful about it, but I don't think it makes sense from like any kind of philosophical perspective or logical perspective. It just doesn't make sense. There's people who have issues with so that's another one where it's like they don't have an issue with the classification in general, but they have an issue with a particular system. One issue that I hear from Catholics especially about Myers-Briggs, well, two really. One is that it's Jungian, and the other one is that it's astrology. Okay, I've heard both of those criticisms of Myers-Briggs in particular from Catholics. I don't know. I don't think Jungian is something necessarily to be afraid of. Jung is a psychologist. He has some crazy ideas. I think it's going to depend a lot more on whether or not you think this stuff is part of his crazy ideas or part of his sane ideas, because some of his ideas are not crazy. And just like pretty much any philosopher, I could even someone as crazy as, Karl Marx, I could tell you something good that they said,
Right.
And Jung is no exception. Even though he's a psychologist and not a philosopher, Jung is no exception to that. And so, calling something Jungian is not necessarily a problem. You have to show that it's from the problematic parts of what he has to say, as opposed to the good parts. But then the astrology one, that one's really worth looking into, right? So I think what people are thinking of is they compare it to like a horoscope, right? Have you ever taken the time to read a horoscope in a newspaper just for fun?
No,
Okay.
I have not.
Do you know how horoscopes get their predictive power? Do you know about this?
Writer in a warehouse somewhere.
Oh, basically. So the person who's writing the horoscope, they make all these statements that are really vague, right? And so the idea is that when someone reads the horoscope for themselves, they see all those vague statements and they fill in all the details to make it apply. right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, when you read a lot of descriptions of the Myers-Briggs types are written in such a way that you could read any number of them and think, oh, yeah, that's me, right? Because in some of these cases, the statements are vague enough that that any number of them could apply to you. And so people rightfully compare that to astrology because it's the same writing style that's used in a horoscope, right? And so they're like, well, I don't want any share of that, right? um, so the problem with that is that number one, horoscopes aren't sinful because they're vaguely written. Horoscopes are sinful because they predict spiritual powers to things that do not have them, right?
Right.
Whatever whatever effect the stars may have on our lives, it certainly cannot be determined with enough specificity to write a horoscope unless you're assuming that they have spiritual powers that rightfully would only be given to angels or demons, right? Or God. So the writing style is not the problem with horoscopes and astrology. It's the ascribing of power to the stars that they do not have. And for which we have no reason to think that they have. Obviously, they do have some power, like gravity, for example, but they don't have the power to do what astrologers say that they do. And so people will call it astrology and they'll write it off when it's really a question of, okay, these vague descriptions that are not helpful to anybody, well, maybe rather than writing off Myers-Briggs as astrology, rather one should say, okay, well, let's find a description that's better. Let's find a description that's actually specific enough where I could conceivably look at myself or look at somebody else and say, okay, they are this and not that, right? So if you're accusing Myers-Briggs of being astrology and wanting to write it off for that reason, you just haven't found a coherent enough description of the different personality types for it, to have actually properly understood them yet.
Is there anyone who you've encountered who critiques Myers-Briggs not on the writing style, but under the assumption that it is in fact occultic, whether it be the ties to Jung or the comparison with astrology? Is it, would you say it's basically just a misunderstanding of, or a misarticulation, a failure to make the distinction between what's occultic and what is the specific element that's occultic, but also as opposed to like just stuff that happens to be associated with that sort of thing, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, I have never seen any kind of criticism on any form of Myers-Briggs that can actually say this is a evil element that should not be here.
Mm-hmm.
It's all association, either guilt by association with Jung because of some of his ideas, or guilt by association with horoscopes because of some of their ideas, or just the whole question of, we don't want to put people in boxes, so why are you doing this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, I think the one criticism that I found, and this is the one my therapist uses, is that people tend to use Myers-Briggs as a way to limit themselves rather than a way to help themselves grow. I'm not sure that that's true. I think that would be something where you might want to look at yourself and be like, okay, am I a better person because I learned about this? Like, really, I would say in my case, I probably am, but, would you say that for yourself? Right. I think that's a good question to ask yourself. Right. But like, that may have been her experience, but I would say in my experience, Myers-Briggs doesn't seem to merit that accusation either. But then, of course, there's just the whole thing of, why do we even put people in boxes in the first place? How does this help? How is this even valid in the first place? That's a criticism that I think is worth looking at. It's really going to get into the weeds, but if you want to go there, I'll go there.
Yes, let's do it. But first,
Okay.
before we get into the weeds, maybe give give our viewers like a brief overview of Myers-Briggs? Like,
Okay.
for those who are not familiar with Myers-Briggs, what is Myers-Briggs? What's like the Cliff Notes overview of
Sure.
the theory in your own
Um,
words?
I want to make sure I get the names right about the founders. The founders. I want to make sure I get the names right. Okay. So, uh, the founders of the Myers-Briggs, which we're talking about the personality system here, not the test, because as I said, the test is bogus. Okay, but the system is a system of describing human personality, which kind of working definition of human personality is this is a it's kind of a personality is kind of a constellation of human dispositions to behave or not to behave, to think or not to think in certain ways that tend to kind of go together. I think that's a definition that we can apply to pretty much any system of personality. That when they use the word personality, that's what they mean, more or less. Um, we could refine that definition later on if we need to, but I think that's a good starting point. Anyway, so Myers-Briggs is a system of personalities developed by, and here's where I'm looking at my screen to get the names right, Catherine Cook Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers. Okay, so these people were inspired by many of the ideas of Carl Jung. Once again, I don't think the ideas they were inspired by were in any way especially problematic from a Catholic point of view. But they were very inspired by Carl Jung, and they decided to classify people according to these ideas and some other thinking and work that they did on their own. So each type in the Myers-Briggs is represented by a 4-letter acronym. Okay, so the first letter is the person an introvert or an extrovert? The second letter is the person a sensor or an intuitive? Okay. The third letter is the person a thinker or a feeler? And the fourth letter is the person a judger or a perceiver? Which we can get into what that means later. But anyway, so that you do it by these 4 acronyms, and some versions stop there. So if you ever discover the version that's they just call it 16 personalities. That's the brand name. They have all these wonderful little like cartoon people that have become memes throughout the internet. They're just very cute, very cute. They just basically stop. They add a 5th letter, which is partly because they're not really a Myers-Briggs system. They're doing something else. We can talk about that too. Anyway, but so some people stop with the 4-letter acronym. But, and this is from Isabel and Catherine, is that this 4-letter acronym is actually supposed to describe the first 2 levels of the person's psyche, what they call functions. So a function is probably what we would refer to more or less as like a mental process. Okay. And there's 8 mental processes, and everyone has one, like a dominant one that looks outward and a dominant one that looks inward. So if your first letter is that extrovert or introvert, so if you have an E as your first letter, your number 1 mental process, your favorite mental process, looks outward, looks outside of yourself. If you have an I as your first letter, your fundamental process, your favorite process, looks inward, inside yourself. The 4th letter, the J or the P, okay, if your letter is a J, that means that whatever process you have that looks outward, that process makes decisions. And if you have a P as your 4th letter, whatever process looks inward makes decisions. Then, okay, so then you have your other one. So if you have a S or an N, right, it means that you're, oh my goodness, how do I explain this? Okay. If you have an S or an N, it means that your favorite process for gathering information, if it's an S, it's gathering sensory information, like concrete information. And then if you have an N for that letter, then your process for gathering information is gathering intellectual abstract information. And then for your T and your F, that's your just for your decision making. If your letter is a T, it means that you make decisions based on what you see as reason. And if yours is an F, it means your favorite way of making decisions is based on, some people would call it emotions, some people might call it feelings, some people might call it kind of a sense of life, or values. Different words are used, and different systems of Myers-Briggs will diverge on precisely what are your definitions of this T and this F. But you're getting kind of a general idea here, right? So let's say you have a type like a, let's do one of your favorites. Let's do the INFJ, right? So your favorite function is going to be one that looks inward, okay? And your outward looking function is going to be one that makes decisions, okay? So your decision making function, that's that third letter, so that's the F. So your favorite function looks inward and looks inward, but your outward looking function makes decision, and that's that F. So an INFJ makes decisions based on an F, a feeling, a sense of life, a value that looks outside themselves. But their kind of favorite thing to do is to, within themselves, gather abstract information that they kind of find within themselves. So we would call those, okay, they've got these two cognitive functions. Their number one cognitive function is intuition that looks inward, abstract thought that looks inward. And then their second function is feeling that makes decisions outward. Okay. So then you could change two of the letters, ENFP, right? The two middle letters are the same, right? But their number one function looks outward, and their decision-making function, that's that P, the P indicates the decision-making function looks inward, right? So their decision-making function is feeling, but it looks inward rather than outward. They're looking at internal values, sense of life, whatever word you want to use there. But their favorite thing to do is to kind of experience abstract things out there in the world, not in their own head, but out there in the world. That's like their favorite thing to do. So I would say the other systems, all the different variations on Myers-Briggs, other than the ones that are just using the acronym and stopping there, are kind of debating back and forth. What are the precise definitions of like what it means to have that introverted feeling? What does it mean to have that introverted intuition or extroverted intuition? So the different versions will debate those details, but this is basically when we talk about the Myers-Briggs system, not the type indicator, because that doesn't work, but the system, this way of classifying people based on their top two cognitive functions, one facing inward, one facing outward, one of which gathers information, one of which makes decisions. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a lot to take
Okay.
in.
So do you want? Yeah.
There's
anyway.
But just to clarify, there's 8 cognitive functions. So there's 16 types, and each type has all 8 of the cognitive functions, but just in different orders. So basically, we all have the same building blocks as everyone else. It's just the ones that we prioritize more are going to be different. And that's where you get the 16 types.
Yeah, I could be remembering incorrectly. It's been a while since I read the original Myers-Briggs book. But my understanding is that the original book from which the personality system is derived really only talks about the top 2. And this thing of like everybody has all 8 just in a different order, this is kind of a later extrapolation. It's also one that I don't know if we can, I don't know if we're looking at for like, oh, what's the evidence that this thing is true, right? I don't know if the evidence is quite as robust for going beyond the first two. Um, I personally think that we can go to the first four pretty reasonably. That's a pretty, maybe not provable in the strict sense of the word, but I'd say that's a pretty safe way to go. I have not yet been convinced that you can go to all eight. You know,
Well, that would depend a lot on your interpretation of the theory, because it says if you go on the interpretation that classifies introverted sensing as memory, then basically like everybody has memory. It's just
right. But I guess it's not that it's not that I don't think people don't have it. It's that I'm not sure that you can validly deduce the order all the way down.
Mm,
You know, because
okay.
like the idea behind this whole stack of eight is once you know the first two, you can deduce the order of the other six. And I'm just not sure that that works. Like everybody has all eight, I'm pretty sure, because of like just the way our souls work, which we can also get into. But like I don't I don't I'm not sure that the order is quite as provable. Like that once you have the first two, you can get all eight. I'm not sure that you can prove that very robustly. It might just be more wishful thinking on the part of theory crafters.
Perhaps. But then you could also say that how much of Myers-Briggs can you actually prove? I've always felt that Myers-Briggs was more useful and less accurate, whereas the Big Five is more accurate and less useful.
Sure.
Because the Myers-Briggs gives you like there's a lot of descriptive language surrounding each personality archetype. And if you the one you test in, you can find a lot of information on that. You can be like, oh, that's how this personality functions. That's it describes the thought processes and the just kind of the internal the system that each type works on. Big Five is like, okay, I'm low in orderliness or I'm high in orderliness. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, I guess I'm just really orderly, you know? It doesn't, there's no like, I mean, there's a little bit of data, at least with Jordan Peterson's version of it. You know, he does have some descriptions of each, range that you test in, but there's not like okay, I have this, these are my results, what does that tell me about myself? Like what kind of like, there's no archetype in the Big Five. There's no template. There's no like really like unified description. It's just like an assortment of the different traits,
Right.
There's no like unified like, okay, my unique particular scores on all these traits makes me this kind of person. There isn't that with the Big Five, but there is that with Myers-Briggs.
Yeah, I think a big question is going to be, okay, we really have to know what these, like, number one, are these cognitive functions real, right? And if they are, what are they in human nature? And then once we can figure that out, we can say, okay, now that we know what these are and how they fit into human nature, is there any validity to this stacking thing? So like let's compare it just for a moment with the four temperaments, because the four temperaments, when it comes to how do we know this is real, is actually really simple. Okay. And the four temperaments in terms of its provability is so simple that you can see that, like, okay, we're going to have to do a lot more work to, in a sense, prove Myers-Briggs here, or we might not be able to get as far as some of these people want to take us. So the temperaments is measuring two things. Okay. The system of the four temperaments is measuring how quickly do you react to something and how long does your reaction last, right?
Right.
So we all react to things. So we clearly have a reaction speed and we clearly have a reaction length of time, right? And so all you have to do is be able to say, okay, is this person's reaction time generally quick or slow? And then is this person's reaction duration generally long or short? And your debates are going to be, okay, where do we draw that line between quick and slow? And where are we going to draw that line between long and short? But that the fact that there are these poles and that everybody has these poles in them is, as far as I can tell, like incontrovertible, like, there's lots of ancillary questions with the four temperaments, like, can they change? I think they can, but, can they change? Where do those lines go? Can you have a mix? What does it mean to have a mix? Like, there's a lot of other questions that get more into the subtle weeds, and I don't really want to go there with the temperaments. But when it comes to just the basic division of the temperaments, it's just reaction time fast, not fast. Reaction duration long, not long. That's it. You have these complete logical divisions, X and not X, quick and not quick, long and not long, complete logical divisions. And you have two of them, and you clearly are always going to have one in each category. You're always going to have a reaction time. You're always going to have a reaction duration. And so the temperaments are just so tidy. Like, if you may question the usefulness of classifying people by the temperaments, but it's really hard to like argue against the categories being coherent categories. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Myers-Briggs is, I would say, a little like number one to get to that point of like, does it even make sense with the first two? Is a little harder, but I think it can be done. But then the stacking, like, is this true? Do we know it by logic? Do we know it instead of by logic, just by observation? Or is this just something somebody made up because they were bored and they saw patterns and they liked to draw patterns, whether they were valid or not? That's a really complicated question.
Yeah, absolutely. Personality is such a it's such an imprecise science because it's all abstract. There's like, I mean, unless you want to get into like the neuroscience theories behind it. If you exclude that, then it's purely abstract. It's based on my own observation of myself. It's based on my own observation of other people. I have my own biases in play with either way, either direction you go. So it's really hard, but I think we can all agree that we're all different. To what degree are we different?
Yeah,
that's the question. The people who resist the classification would say that we're all like completely different. And I don't know if I would agree with that. I would say that, we're all completely different, but to what degree? Like, I would, my own personal theory would be like, I would say that we're like 75, maybe 50 to 75% of us falls in the ballpark of something. And then the last 50 or 25 to 50% is like uniquely me. But there's so many people in the world that I suppose miracles are possible. I suppose 8 billion people, however many people we have, could all be 100% unique, but I don't think so. So I think we can all at least agree that everybody's different. But here's where it gets interesting. It's like, so going back to Myers-Briggs and specifically, like, we can pick any system, but we decided that this would be mostly about Myers-Briggs. So what kind of like interpersonal conflicts does Myers-Briggs shed light on? And does Western society, do any societies like have like their own favorite types that they like hold up as models for the whole society to emulate, while the other types are just kind of like devalued? Is that a thing? Like, do you think that's a thing, or is that just like, is that a myth that some people just like to say if they're underperforming in life, they just like to blame it on oh, well, they just don't like my type kind of thing.
Sure.
So what are your thoughts on those?
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of like, because I know for myself, there were certain kinds of interpersonal conflicts that I felt like Myers-Briggs really helped me with specifically. So, like the whole difference between introverts and extroverts, all kinds of people acknowledge that. Myers-Briggs is not especially unique in that area, right?
Right.
Um, but I would say once you get kind of past that point, there's actually a lot of like, there's actually a lot of like there's things that I think Myers-Briggs really does help with. So, so for example, um, just a review of all 8 cognitive functions, just so that they're very clear in our minds when we start talking about this, right? So, like, you have your you have your 4 functions that gather information. You have introverted sensing, which is I like to look to concrete experiences that I have within myself. So people often compare it to memory. Is it the exact same thing? We'll see. But it's memory like, okay? It's memory like, it's habit like. It's we tried this and it works. It's it's akin to those kinds of things. I use that word akin rather than is, because is a really strong word here. Then there's extroverted sensing, which is I look toward concrete experiences that happen outside of myself. So this is akin to, I'm tasting my food. I'm being an adrenaline junkie. I'm, observing the canvas of the work of art. Those would all be often very extroverted sensing kind of activities. Then there's introverted intuition. I look within myself and I gather information through this kind of abstract process within myself. Um, this one is hard to explain.
That would be because, and I can jump in here, being an NI user
Yeah,
myself.
I don't have this function high up in my stack, if at all. So I have a really hard time explaining what this thing is. But go on.
For me, it's very, it's not. There's no like, there's no words for it. It's like a purely abstract process that you can't taste it, you can't see it, you can't hear it, you can't like. I really think that that's one of the reasons why I struggle with speaking so much sometimes. Like some of it might be neurological impairments, but I think a big part of it is I have this sort of like subconscious, unsensory, nonverbal process of distillation of data and coming to conclusions and knowing that I just can't put into words. And so to try and like force that into a verbal articulation it hurts.
Yeah.
So
So
I don't
yeah.
know if that's just me, but I've most of the time I test as either an INTJ or INFJ. So they're
Tests don't matter, but anyway, but yeah, NI is compared to sometimes things like perhaps mystical visions, or sometimes it's compared to things like um, what one wants for oneself, kind of one's sense of purpose in life. Anyway, okay. Then there's extroverted intuition, which is kind of experiencing abstract ideas out there in the world. So this would be like, investigating the philosophical ideas of another person, um, you know, um, kind of seeing the world not with one's senses, but with kind of oh, this means this, like imagine you're sitting in front of a cliff and the cliff has like these colorful layers, right? Um, an SI might say, oh, I've been here before, it was nice. An SE might say, look at the colors. An NE would probably say, well, this shows that there was like geological formation. And if someone asked them, but do you like what you see? They'd probably be like, huh? Or they might be like, this is something I did a lot as a kid. I have a high NE in my, I have a high NE in mine, but I would like visit a forest and I'd be like bored in the forest. So I'd be like, which fantasy novel would this be from? Um, um, and then the NI might kind of get this sense of like what the cliff is or means, but maybe not necessarily need to articulate it. Anyway, okay. Then you have your 4 decision-making functions. You have extroverted feeling, kind of experiencing life and values as something kind of out there in the world. It gets compared to kind of like group identity, group values, like doing things for the common good. Then you have introverted feeling, which is like one sense of value or life that gets one experiences within oneself. So this gets compared to things like how am I feeling, or what is my own personal conscience on this matter, or also things of like I saw it once compared to like the school of philosophy called phenomenology, right, where the most basic data that one investigates is like a experience that one is living, right? um, that you don't look at your own experience in such a way where you pretend like you're not having it, like that would be a very un-FI thing to do. And then there's extroverted thinking, which is like making things happen in a sense out in the world, or like using reason out in the external world. This one's often compared to like like effective management, the hard sciences, treating people like pieces on a chessboard. That's another common image for TE. And then there's the introverted thinking, the TI, which is like more like pure reason, logic, kind of reducing things to their component parts in kind of a more academic way. So anyway, but in an internal logical experience. Okay, so you have all these, so you have these 8 functions. And so how does this help us deal with intrapersonal conflicts? So here's some example conflicts that this might help resolve, right? So let's say you're a parent, right? And you're trying to teach values to your child, right? One type of parent, one that has introverted sensing high in the stack, is probably going to teach values in terms of rules, right? We do this, we don't do this. This is within limits, this is outside of the limits, right? And whereas someone who has introverted feeling high in the stack is probably going to try to inculcate a sense of value that's a little more wordless and a little more felt. Okay. So like, so like this might be the sort of thing of like, why did you act so, rather than saying, oh, you broke this rule, they might say like, well, why did you act with such a lack of compassion? Why did you treat this person this way when, they're a human being? And so like neither method of teaching is necessarily bad, but you can see how the two might talk past each other, right? So Aaron, you and I grew up in an age of relativism. I think that's an age that is in many ways passing. That's maybe a question for another day. But in people who had introverted feeling they often seemed very comfortable with that kind of way of thinking, or at least it seemed so to us, where it was kind of like, they place no value on a rule of conduct, where it was perhaps maybe just a different way of talking about right and wrong that to someone who was more of a rule follower seemed just incredibly chaotic, right? So that's one example of an interpersonal conflict that perhaps Myers-Briggs could help resolve. Another would be like kind of the classic conundrum of like, the person who knows what the right thing, what the most efficient way to do something is, and hurts people's feelings in the process, right? You know, and like they're like, this makes so much sense. Why is nobody doing it? You're like, well, because you're a jerk, you know. It's not necessarily because they're a bad person, but it's because their first thought was, you know, for lack of a better word, this extroverted thinking way of looking at the world of like, okay, I have this goal that I want to achieve. These are the steps that make sense to reach that goal based on the data that I have, right? But then people don't really fit nicely into a data category, or at least if you try to fit them in, it's a very complicated process. And so, you know, someone who is more attentive to, for example, extroverted feeling would be like, their mind wouldn't even go there because they would immediately see, well, I need other people to get this done. I have to win them over, and that's not going to do it. You know, and so, you know, that would be another kind of interpersonal conflict that could potentially get resolved. I think what draws a lot of people to Myers-Briggs in terms of like why do people like it? I think for a lot of them, it's the sensing versus intuition distinction. You know, where they have certain things that they want to talk about and that they find interesting that are hard to describe according to the senses, right? You can't say necessarily how the things they're interested in look or touch or taste or smell or their location in space, right? Because they're more abstract things. And they try to talk about these things that they care so much about to people, and people just look at them like they're crazy, right? And then they learn about Myers-Briggs and they're like, okay, that person was probably a sensor. I'm probably an intuitive, whether extroverted or introverted, it doesn't really matter at this point, right? And they're like, okay, this is why I'm having so much trouble communicating with this person. And sometimes Myers-Briggs will make those people really arrogant and full of themselves. And sometimes it will help them appreciate these people who they thought were either insensitive or dumb before, you know. And I think that is a very common interpersonal conflict that I think tends to be often the one that draws people into the system, because, you know, I don't feel like a lot of other personality systems deal with that conflict specifically. Um, yeah. Anyway,
Would you say that intuition versus sensing is also big picture versus small picture?
that probably depends on which school of Myers-Briggs you're going to subscribe to.
Mm.
Um, it also depends on how exactly you want to define big picture versus small picture. I think kind of the orthodox starting point for intuitive versus sensing is, okay, do they is their primary information gathering experience abstract, that is not based directly in the senses, or is it concrete, based much closer to the senses, whether their literal sense experience or their kind of internally held sense experience? And so, like, there's debate, I think, whether certain things count in one category or the other. So, for example, let's take a person who really loves reading all the footnotes on a doctoral dissertation in canon law. Okay. For some people, this looks like a very sensory experience, right? Because they're looking into these really fine details that, you know, sometimes don't have a whole lot to do with the big picture. On the other hand, this could be a really abstract experience because you could read sentence after sentence after sentence in these footnotes and never encounter a noun that refers to something you can point to.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the reason I think of them as big picture versus small picture, one reason is that when you live in the world of your own senses, that world is very much limited to what you can sense. But in the world of the abstract and the intuitive, you have to start with what you sense, if that makes any sense.
If you're an
Because
Aristotelian, which, you know. I think some people are, but go on.
Because that's the only way we get information, right? Is through our senses. But what happens to that is, at least for me as an NI user, is you digest and you kind of boil down all that sensory information and you uncover like a guiding principle, and that kind of principle applies broadly to like all of reality, whereas the sensor is like kind of local. They're more like, okay, I did this thing today, therefore my memory is going to be of this thing today. Or I read this book, and so my memory is going to be of literally what was in the book. Of course, then you have people like dear Kristen, who sometimes she says she's an ESFP, but sometimes you wonder, like, is she really an ENFP with the way she's like just so masterfully creative with all the different types and understanding them and all that sort of thing. But I guess I bring that up because sometimes it seems like there's people I meet that they're like unicorns who are interested in kind of these guiding principles over all of reality and the universe and whatnot. But most people are just interested in what they experience directly themselves, and they don't like to like imagine outside of that, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I'm still a little skeptical that the intuitive sensor distinction is a good match for the big picture, small detail distinction. Because if you're looking at the overarching principles of how the universe works, depending on your philosophical convictions, the general principles of how the universe work might look a lot like really small physical details.
Can you elaborate?
So if you are a materialist philosopher, okay, who is in tune with modern science, the fundamental principles of how the universe works are tiny, right? They're subatomic particles and how these particles interact. That is the fundamental things of how the universe works for those people, right? Now, they're wrong, but like they're very interested in what are the fundamental things of how the universe works, and yet those fundamental principles seem to them to be very small, very detailed, and very physical. And so, like, to me, it's more like, okay, did they gather this information in a concrete way or in an abstract way? And I think if you're going to come to a conclusion like that, there has to be a lot of abstraction involved, but it's not necessary, but it looks a lot like really particular attention to very physical details. And yet there's a lot of abstraction involved.
Fair point. It's true that obviously the details are not non-existent for the big picture thinker or the intuitive, but as I argued before, I think it makes sense that each type has all 8 cognitive functions, and so even someone who's high in intuition is going to have introverted sensing. So even if the bulk of their action might be they might start from a place of big picture abstraction, but they can like dip into, and some of the Myers-Briggs people have talked about the dip. They can like dip into introverted sensing in service of that abstract big picture.
Sure. Now, I don't disagree that there's something to the bigger stack ways of looking at this. I just think they're very hard to prove. I think, I'm not saying they're without value. I just think they're very hard to prove. Let me just kind of walk through you a proof, for lack of a better word, that we have 2. Okay. Let's just get there.
Okay.
So human beings we all take in information in some way or other, right? We have information intake, right? We know things. We have to get those things from somewhere, right?
Hmm.
Um, and then so that so when it, and we also know that we human beings have different ways of taking in that information, right? We have five senses. We can conceivably think of more ways of taking in information, right? And so if you have multiple ways of taking in information, all you have to do to get to a cognitive function is to assume that one of those ways is your favorite. Okay. That's all it takes. And that will give you either your first function or your second function. Okay. Then all human beings make decisions. We have wills, right? We make decisions. We make those decisions on a, you know, the will is blind, right? So there's some kind of cognitive intellectual process to when it comes to making decisions, right? So then if there are different ways one can come to a decision, which I think we have to agree that there are, because sometimes you make a decision based on preferences and sometimes you make a decision based on something other than preferences, just to give one example, right? If there are ways to, if there are different ways to make decision, all it has to do to get to some kind of cognitive function is for one of those ways to be your favorite, right?
Hmm.
And that gives you, once again, either your first function or your second function. And so then it's a question of like, okay, if it were up to me, would I rather make some kind of decision or would I rather get some kind of information, right? If you would prefer to, and so like, but like you have two functions. You have a first place, you have a second place. Your first place is either going to be about making decisions or about gathering information because everybody
Hmm.
does both. And then your second function is either going to be about making decisions or gathering information because everybody does both. So now you have the two functions that set up your personality. Now, why are those thinking, feeling, in sensing, intuition, blah, blah, blah? Okay, that's maybe a little more involved question, but you can at least begin to see how one could get to two functions.
Right.
Um, I think once you get to those two functions, it's like, okay, my decision making function. Do I prefer to make decisions about things outside of me, or do I prefer to make decisions about things within me? Okay, that'll get you to whether basically you're a J or a P, right?
Hmm.
Um, and then your information gathering function. Do I prefer to gather information from outside myself, or do I prefer to gather information that's already within myself? Um, that'll get you to your extroverted, you're in, one side or the other, right? And then like, okay, I have to deal with both the outside and the inside, right? If I can't, if both of my two favorite functions are both on the inside, okay, that's not going to work. If both of my functions are on the outside, that's not going to work too well, right? So it's like you can begin to see how the pieces kind of fall together for the first two functions.
Hmm.
But then once you start asking the question of like, okay, so my favorite function for gathering information is to look outside myself and find abstract things out there. Does it follow that my second favorite way of gathering information is to look inside myself for concrete experiences, which is what these stack theories would posit? And I'm not sure that follows. I think
I'm
it's
curious.
likely,
I'm
but I'm not
curious.
sure.
I'm curious to know what these non-sensory forms of taking in information are.
Yes, yes. Okay. So this would be so remember I said your favorite. I'm not talking about your first chronologically.
Did I
Because
say? Did I
everybody's
say non-fit? Well, I mean, well, you said that there were non-sensory ways of gathering
right,
information.
but
Like,
they're
what
not
would those be?
necessarily. I'm talking about our favorite way of gathering information does not mean the one that comes chronologically first. Because as you acknowledged, everything that we know in a sense has to begin in our senses, right?
Okay, I thought you were
Right.
inferring that there were ways that it could begin aside from the
Well,
science. And I was just like,
there's mystical enlightenment, but that would be beyond
yeah,
the
that's
scope
what
of
I was
this
thinking.
project.
But that's not that's
Are
a
there people
normal way.
whose favorite way of gathering information is mystical enlightenment? Absolutely, but that doesn't. They would, they're either kooks or that falls into the realm of the supernatural, and
Yeah. Yeah.
that's not
Okay.
part of necessarily what
Okay.
we're talking.
So yeah. So basically, there's again, my not to harp on this too much, but my argument was that for the sensors, their favorite mode of operation is to experience and remember the sensory world as it was that they experienced, either as they're experiencing it right now. It's like color red. What does that mean? That's the color red. I'm experiencing the color red right now. Or I remember experiencing the color red in my childhood. And they're not inclined to move beyond that sensory experience very much. They are a little, because everyone has intuitive functions and they have them, but they're low down there. So it would make sense to me that, generally speaking, their tendency is to stay very localized. That makes any sense? Whereas the intuitive is like, okay, I'm taking this information through my senses, but I want to make sense of it. I want to either understand what it means, or for me, for everyone, or I want to like use that information in order to come up with new things, new ideas of some kind. So it seems to me it's a very like, you start for the intuitive, you start local and then you go big. But then I guess you could also say that
I think the intuitive jumps to the abstract quickly and easily.
yeah.
So
Well, the
I want.
abstract is the abstract, and I guess the big question is the abstract something that is governing? Is it like a governing law of reality? Or is it, or can it ever be something that is only specific to the person? And
The title of this podcast is Rise Above Heartless Materialism. We have to get here somewhere, right? So, human beings are not entirely physical creatures, right? We experience things in our senses, but we are more than that.
Mhm.
And so the abstract is in some way the processed. I'm going to use the word the processed here. In the sense of like, so if you look at like certain schools of philosophy use the word abstract as like a technical term and as a verb, right? And so like if you're looking at someone like Aristotle or St. Thomas Aquinas, the verb to abstract means to basically, okay, here's this sense experience that I've had. My soul, and I'm talking literally about the soul here, this is impossible with only a body, but my soul is going to draw out from this sensory experience something that is not bound to what is material. And so the to abstract is to, in computerish terms, but not really, but it's to do this thing where you take your sensory experience and you make something true, you make something real, but it's something that is dematerialized. It's made spiritual. It's made something that's like what the soul is. It's so it's beyond the body. And so I'm not saying this is a value judgment, but the processes that the intuitives tend toward are going to move there faster. That doesn't mean that they're more accurate. That doesn't mean that they're better. It means they're going to make that jump they're going to make that jump sooner. So
Right.
so like my example of okay, I'm in the forest, right? I'm in the forest, I'm experiencing the forest, I'm seeing the forest. Okay. My senses are working, but my preference is to do something along the lines of what fantasy novel does this forest belong in? Right. And so this is several layers removed from the physical experience of the forest. Number one, I have to be able to identify it as a forest, right? Which is already one step removed from the physical experience. Number two, I have to employ language to be able to read and understand fantasy novels, which is once again one step removed from the physical, because to understand language requires some use of something more than the material. I think I think I don't think we've quite answered the question of whether dumb animals can use language, but at least at this point in the development of the universe, it seems likely that they cannot. um,
Really?
I mean, in the sense of like actually be able to speak in language as opposed to respond to a sensory stimulus, to
Mm.
understand what they say, as opposed to be able to respond to it as a stimulus or use it as a tool to get what they want.
Because I just read a highly scientific meme that claimed that chickens can make 30 different sounds.
Great. That doesn't mean that they understand language.
Right.
That just means that they
Wouldn't that
can
be a
get
primitive sort of language, though?
it isn't unlike language. One of the things that we use language for is to get what we want. Okay.
Mm.
Um, uh, whether that's the preservation of the species or whether that's the acquisition of food, like we can use language to get what we want, but that we can do that you can do that with understanding or without understanding. And it's
Mm.
the understanding part,
Yeah.
that, I haven't seen a reason yet to posit that chickens can do. Now, I could be wrong, right? Like, I am not, I I find it unlikely that chickens would be able to understand language because they're chickens, but I don't want to rule it out entirely. Um, you know, a lot of it depends on how exactly you're going to be defining the word understanding.
Right.
Um, but anyway, but there's this, like if I'm going to experience the forest as something from a fantasy novel, there is a lot of processing that has to go on to make that happen, right?
Mm.
Um, and the example of the fantasy forest is great because there is nothing true or accurate about that perception, right? I can experience a particular tree in the Rocky Mountains as being in Rivendell all I want, and it is not true.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, it's quite false. But it's a place that kind of my mind, as someone who uses
Yeah.
extroverted intuition a lot, it's a place that my mind naturally goes to.
Maybe that's something that maybe that's the cause of our disconnect here is you're speaking of NE, I'm speaking of NI. Because NI is very convergent. It's all about like, I remember reading that it was described as or compared to like four blind people. And one of them says, these are legs. This is a tail. This is a trunk.
Mhm.
And NI takes all that and says, "Oh, we're looking at an elephant." So it takes separated pieces of information and it binds them together with one universal uh, guiding principle to cover
Yeah,
all of them.
and
Whereas NE is more like I start with one thing and then it's more expansive. It's more like, oh, I take one object. Well, I can use it for this, or I can use it for this, or I can use it for this, or this, or this, or this. It's the idea generator kind of thing. So
yeah,
I guess that would be less. I would still say, and I don't have any solid proof for this evidence, but I'm just going to say that I think that NE would still be more big picture than like the sensing functions, but it would be less big picture than NI, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
Does that sound, does that sound
that
fair?
is
Or?
a that is a theory that I have seen bandied about that has, I think, some validity to it. I'm not sure I'm willing to subscribe to it completely, but I would say it's a possibility.
Yeah,
But it
yeah,
doesn't. I don't think it necessarily gets at like the fundamental nature of what these things are.
right,
It might be a summary that ends up being true after the fact, but it doesn't get at the fundamental nature of what these things are. It may very well be true, but it's not what they are.
right. Well, I'd like to jump to the next question that
Okay.
I
Yes.
asked. The part two,
I
we did.
wasn't expecting you to be the one to take us off topic here. I was expecting me to be the one who did that.
I am a J.
Anyway.
I am a J after all. I really want to get to this one. Do you think that Western society or any societies in general, do they tend to like favor certain types more than others? So like, do they have like one or two types that they say this is the model of what a good citizen is, and then kind of like downplay the others? I know this is kind of like a tricky. These are dangerous waters to swim in, but I'm all about swimming in dangerous waters nicely.
Yeah. So you may recall the 16 personalities people, which, like I said, is not real Myers-Briggs, but it's similar. The 16 personalities people do these like country profiles where they'll be like, okay, these are the types that are overrepresented in this country and underrepresented in this other country, right? But whether that's because those types are actually underrepresented, or whether it's because, oh, these are the types of people who in that country are driven to take the MBTI because they feel so excluded by their society.
Hmm.
I remember, for example, that like I think Japan, for example, had a really, really high proportion of what to them was an ISFP. Okay, that was a really common type in Japan. I was like, I could see that being kind of, in a sense, the Japanese national type, for lack of a better word, if we're going to really go deep into the stereotyping weeds here. But I could also see it being exactly the opposite, that is not,
Hmm.
a common type, but that those are the people who, in a sense, are most attracted to this because they feel the most like in need of what it has to provide. So anyway, so I'd say take their studies, for lack of a better word, with a grain of salt. I think there's more than one explanation as to why certain types were showing up more often in certain countries according to their metrics. I think there's a lot of ways that could go. Anyway, does a society favor certain types more than others? I think in certain kind of very basic ways, you can kind of see it that certain societies kind of have to because of circumstances, right? So, like, let's say you live in a hunter-gatherer society, right? Your ability to survive depends upon your ability to use your five senses well, right? Because you need to be able to see
Mhm.
that slight little difference in shade, which will tell you which berry will kill you and which berry will feed you, right? You need to be present enough to your ears to be able to hear the predator before it attacks you. And so like, is there a place for other people in the society? Absolutely. But you can kind of see how that society would push people to be a certain way. Now, I am not a member of a hunter-gatherer society. Maybe someone who's a hunter-gatherer would say, oh, Father, you have it all wrong. It's actually the, NIs that are favored in this society because of this circumstance and that circumstance and that circumstance, right? So like, am I saying a hunter-gatherer society is necessarily favoring SE people? I mean, it seems plausible to me. Is it true? I don't know. It seems plausible, but is it true? Um, when it comes to like societies now, right? Something that we can actually observe. Um, I think part of it, like a society is like almost too big, right? So like here in the United States, it's like I could make a big generalization like the United States prefers SJs, but like who in the society exactly? Like let's say you worked in a R&D department, inventing new things like my dad did for many years, right? Are they going to prefer SJs? Maybe they will, maybe they won't, right? Um, let's say you're working in a elementary school, you know, what are they going to prefer? That's totally different from you know, let's say you work in a university, right? Like you're both working in education, you're both working in the same society. Your buildings might even be next to each other, but like, you know, I could see how the preferences in those little microcosms within society could be really quite different. Um, so, you know, I think the question, does Western society favor certain times more than others, is just really hard to answer because so much of it's going to depend on um, like where are you working, who are you around, what kinds of things are expected of you particularly. Now, another way of looking at it could be like, what kind of person does this society pressure me to become? Perhaps you might say in an educational way, right? Like what kind of person does does this culture pressure me to be? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's an interesting one. I think there are a lot of things in the world that kind of encourage people to use SI a lot. Um, because so much of our world is based on um, so much of our education, rather, so much of our education is based on being able to perform certain routines on a regular basis, right? So it's like, okay, you have to be at the school at this time, you have to have these items, you go through the things in this order, and like if you mess up the order, like they wouldn't call you a bad person, right? But you haven't succeeded at the thing they're trying to get you to do that day, right? Um, if you if you go to the wrong classroom, like you might not get in trouble, but that's technically a failure, if that makes sense. So there's all these very physical things that have to happen to make those formative experiences be successful according to the convention that the system sets up, right?
Mm.
And that's not that by itself is not a value judgment. I have all kinds of thoughts on the American school system that are probably beyond the scope of this. But to say that they, in a sense, favor SI is not by itself a value judgment. On the other hand, I do think that there are, we hold up certain professions or ways of life as heroic that model something quite different. You know, um, so like for example, think of the esteem in which we hold athletes, right? An athlete is, and someone might want to debate me based on the particular sport, right? But an athlete is something where you look at something more like SE or TE, right? Those are kinds of the sorts of things that will actually help you be an athlete because you're making something happen in the physical world, very TE, right? But also you have to have these great powers of observation of what's actually going around you at the time. I I struggled in sports at least partly because I had a really hard time paying attention to what was going on around me. It's like, oh, my eyes have to actually track this ball instead of thinking about something much more interesting. Like, like that was hard for me. It's like watching this ball fly at my face is kind of boring, um, uh, you know, um, not inherently so, but just because of the functions that were active in my life at the time. And so like, so like there's a certain so like there's a certain promotion of those functions that I think is found in a lot of, found in our world that kind of runs against that SI grain, right? Or you can look at certain sections of the society that, like think of like your, um, think of like your, think of like your stereotypical Asian parent. You will be a lawyer or a doctor, right? Or a failure. You'll be a lawyer or a doctor or a failure, right? And it's like, okay, one can make the case that doctor is a very SI profession, but it's like lawyer to me seems like a very TI sort of profession, right? You
Mhm.
have these very, I think, abstract rules, like they're often, there's a lot of like there's a lot of logic going on that has nothing to do with something you're experiencing in your senses, either now or previously. Um, that a lawyer really has to deal with, and you know, so and that's a profession that you know many parents would be thrilled if their kids ended up as a lawyer. Maybe not because of the work they would do, because it's like, oh yeah, you're going to be successful and make money, and
Mhm. I think you can
um,
make an argument that as civilization progresses, that SI becomes more and more important for the majority of people because what to do has already been figured out before you. And so all you need to do is memorize and apply.
yeah, I mean,
Obviously, that's it's not completely
not
true.
all not all progress is positive for one thing, and
Well, yeah, but obviously there are exceptions like research and development. You're probably going to want intuitives, or are you?
but the other thing too is like how do you define success? Like in a certain sense in school, success is defined for you, but like there's also kind of this thing that like a very, I don't know if it's a healthy idea, but there's an idea out there that success means different things to different people, right?
Hmm.
And so like and so like you know and there and it's does is there an actual condemnation in our society for people whose vision of success looks a certain way? I, like in certain subsections of society, sure, maybe, but like, is there one overarching, like, this is what success looks like for a 21st century American? Like, if you are successful, you are this. Like, I'm not I'm not entirely sure that exists.
I think it did when we were growing up, not so much anymore.
Okay, so what was it when we were growing up?
You go to college, you get a standard job, and you get married and raise a family and have kids.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I
I
yeah,
mean,
there's
that probably was the definition of success for quite some time prior to that. But then the big disruption happened with tech and all sorts of things, social media, and now we have the anti-narrative where anything that is or has been established is being questioned for better or worse. And so now people are like, well, you shouldn't have one definition of success. It can be whatever you want.
call me irrational, but I am very allergic to the idea that family and children is associated with any one particular cognitive function or even set of cognitive functions. I know you're probably going to want to associate it with SI, but I do not want to do that. Um,
I would think more SC actually. Well, at least for young babies, it's definitely SC because you have to like respond in the moment all the time.
Oh yeah, I'm
That's
not
it.
I'm not saying there aren't particular functions that are more useful for particular things, but like overall, I don't think that the kind of a narrative of get married and have children is going to push people into any particular cognitive. Like I don't think that in
Oh,
itself is.
yeah, I would agree. I don't think that that in particular is going to because different functions, different types are going to have be stronger or weaker in different areas of parenting. I think that's definitely true.
Yeah,
You
but
make
yeah,
you can make a case that sensors are going to be more, well, no, you can't, because your kids are going to be all different types. So
yeah.
you're
So
gonna
anyway,
work well with some, and you're gonna not work well with others. So
yeah.
it's kind of a mix. But as far as like go to college, get a job kind of thing, that's a very SI thing, because when you're going to school, you have to remember what you're taught and apply it. That's basically your number one job most of the time. Like sometimes, like in various professions, you can be kind of creative, but even so, your creativity is usually evaluated based on how well you incorporated X, Y, and Z principle that you were taught. And then going to get a job, like when you start out in a job, they don't want you to be innovative. They just want you to memorize and repeat kind of thing most of the time. So I would say it's a very SI sort of thing. And I've come
And
to
while
terms.
I would say that has been my personal experience, I also don't want to extend my job experience as something that is meant to be applied to the society at large, because I'm in a rather niche profession.
Yeah. But I've also come to terms with the fact that even though I'm, uh, you know, the most intuitive you can get and the less sensing you can get, I've come to terms with the fact that if 75% of the population wasn't sensing, if 50% wasn't SI users, then society would fall apart. It would just completely fall apart. It would be anarchy. It would be Mad Max, even though I haven't seen Mad Max, but I hear about it. It just wouldn't work, because nobody would because most of civilization is about
I I
maintenance.
heard I heard I heard this on the internet, so I don't know if it's true, but I so hope it's true. I
Why?
heard that Mad Max and the movie about the pig Babe were written by the same person.
Oh, that'd be hilarious.
I so hope it's true. There's a lot of things that I hope are true, but which I haven't taken the trouble to verify or not yet.
I
Sometimes
know that
I can't.
feeling. That you
Sometimes they
can't.
don't. Like evolution, I really want evolution to be true. I kind of doubt that it is, but I really want it to be true. It's such a wonderful story.
Except when you get into the whole part of humans evolving from apes. I just have real problems with that. The rest of it, yeah, anything can evolve from anything else as much as it wants to, but humans evolving from apes, I'm just like, no, no, it just does. To me, it doesn't make theological, metaphysical sense. Like, God made man special. He didn't be like, oh, you used to be something not special, not set apart, because Christ died for human beings. He didn't die for apes. So I know that's a strangely fundamentalist position of mine, but there it is.
It is a position which it is legitimate for a Catholic to hold. So
That is true. That is true. That's true.
isn't necessarily a popular one, but it's certainly legitimate. So um, yeah.
Yeah. Uh, let's switch gears a little bit. How does Myers-Briggs, how does one's Myers-Briggs type influence their spiritual life?
Oh, that's a good question. My mind immediately, first of all, jumps to there are certain people who will recommend a spirituality for you based on what your time comes up to be in a test. I have not taken one of these. My aunt did, and she's my godmother, so I have to at least, I do respect her opinion a great deal because she's wise and she's my godmother, and her job is to advise me. But anyway, she took one time, and I can't remember what she got, and I can't remember what spirituality they said she was. But anyway, that is one option. I'd say that's kind of a surface level option. Um, I do think that with all personality types, knowing yourself is going to help you in your spiritual life because it's going to be able to help you distinguish between, okay, what is a characteristic reaction of me versus okay, here's something where God is really intervening here, right? And like, sure, God could intervene in a way that's like normal to you, right? But you have to know what normal to you is before you can even start to look, right? So, like, once again, I use a lot of extroverted intuition. Okay. Extroverted intuition to a lot of people appears just like an inspiration from the Holy Spirit, right? I put it in quotes because not the Holy Spirit absolutely does inspire people. He certainly does, right? But it doesn't always look like extroverted intuition. And
Mm-hmm.
I, as someone who uses a lot of extroverted intuition, have kind of had to train myself to like, okay, that's just an idea. You know, you can come up with ideas all you want, but the voice of God is different, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one, or I think other functions have to do the same thing, right? It's like, like let's say you get someone who's got really high TI, right? And they're theologizing. Okay. Um, I have also done this, but this one is one that I don't feel like is necessarily as personal to myself because I do it all the time. I see it all the time, right? They're theologizing. They're using logic about the things of God. Great. That doesn't make you holy, right? It might help. It might be a step along the way. It's like, oh, I do this thing. I'm so good at it. I'm so holy. Not necessarily, right? Um, you know, um, someone who is SI, they really great at following the commandments, right? Perhaps one way of looking at it. I think there's plenty of SIs who struggle with that. But to be really stereotypical here, SI, really great at following the commandments. There's literally a gospel reading about that, where Jesus then says to the guy, go sell all that you have and give to the poor. And then the man went away sad because he had many possessions, right?
Yeah, that
you
would
know,
be an SI user.
um, I mean, we can't type that man in the gospel. We don't know enough about him, right? But it's like, if your claim to
That would be a situation that SI
yeah,
users might find
if
themselves
your
in.
claim to holiness is I'm an SI, I'm good at knowing and following the rules. I know and follow the rules. Well, have we got a gospel for you? And I think you could do this. I think you could do this with a lot of the functions where it's like, okay, like I can't make this thing that I'm naturally disposed to the be all and end all of my spiritual life. Now, it could be a really valuable ingredient, but it's
Mhm.
not going to be the whole story. And
Right.
knowing my baseline is going to be really helpful for me when I grow. One of the things that I find interesting is if you like try to type the saints, right? Some of them are really like on brand, and some of them are not.
Pop cost St. Philip Neri.
Uh, I'd call him probably one of the on brand ones.
Oh, really?
I think so.
I've heard he was kind of a little different and frustrated the more serious peers of the clergy at this time.
I don't know if I don't know enough about his life to say it, but like I would say an example of a really on brand saint. Okay, John Paul II is very on brand. Like you start hearing about him as a child, he's giving ENFJ vibes from the very beginning, right? And then he becomes Pope, and what does he do? He behaves like an ENFJ and changes the world. I'm not saying he didn't ever have to work on his weaknesses because obviously he did, right? But here's a guy who he had a Myers. You can make a claim he had this Myers-Briggs type. I'm just going to say he's ENFJ. I could be wrong, but I'm just going to say that because I think it's probably true. And he behaves like it through his whole life and becomes a saint, right? Then you have someone like Saint Ignatius of Loyola, right? Who I know you and I have talked about before. I'm convinced that Saint Ignatius of Loyola was born in ESFP. Okay, that is not how you would characterize him in his saintly phase. Like, no one is looking at Saint Ignatius of Loyola and thinking, "Oh, what a party animal," like, um, you know, um, we could, if you really want to, I can go into the reasons for why I think he's an ESFP, but like the guy doesn't like when we think of like what makes this guy a saint, we don't think of like ESFP things.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm not going to say he's a greater or lesser saint than John Paul II, because that's way above my pay grade. But you have some who are really on brand, you have some who are really off brand. You have ones who it's really hard to tell. Saint Teresa of Avila, like, I think I think a big part of whether or not you consider Saint Teresa of Avila on brand or off brand is, what I'm pretty sure Saint Teresa of Avila was born an ENTP. Okay, if I
Mhm.
had to pin her down, but like when you look at the end of her life, is that ENTP behavior or is that something else? Like I think you can make a case both ways that
Mhm.
she's either on brand or off. So so some it's harder to tell. But yeah, you get yeah. But like when you read about the saints and you're like, okay, if I try to type the saints, right? Like I can get a little bit of insight into like, okay, this is what the road to perfection looks like, right? Like I was like, oh, okay, they had these functions and oh, they did it like this. Okay, not that you're going to copy them, but you start recognizing some patterns that may be helpful for your own life. Um, and I think also when it comes to like spiritual reading, certain kinds of spiritual reading are going to appeal to some types more than others. Like
Right.
I, um, you know, I would say, what was the kind of spiritual reading I had a lot of growing up that just didn't resonate with me. Like a lot of spiritual stuff didn't resonate with me until it was presented to me in a very like TI kind of way. Once that door was opened, I was kind of able to go back and be like, oh, that's what they were trying to do in some of the um, less TI spiritual presentations that I was presented with when I was at certain points in my life. I was able to go back and appreciate them a lot more. But it took this very TI key to unlock a lot of that stuff for me that someone else might not need, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It might interest you to know that right now my spiritual life is very SI.
Interesting. Yeah, that's
It's
not normal. That's not normal, Aaron Kessler, right there.
no, no, it's very much do this, have this routine, do this every day.
Yeah, well, it's got its place. It's got its place.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. So, would you say that people become more the same the holier they get, which is kind of suggested by the four temperaments theory? It says that the holier you get, the more balanced you will become out of all the four temperaments. Or do they become more perfected versions of their unique type or temperament?
Hmm.
Which there's a quote by Bishop Fulton Sheen, which says something to the effect of the saints become more different as they get holier, and sinners are all the same.
Yeah. Um, okay. I mean, first of all, I'll just say that opening line of Anna Karenina from Leo Tolstoy, every happy family is the same, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. I totally disagree with. Tolstoy's great, but sorry, your first line of that book is pretty messed up. But we're talking about individuals here, and we're talking about more than just family. We're talking about all kinds of holiness. So we're gonna have to get into the philosophical weeds on this one. There's
Mm,
there's no avoiding it. So okay, so um, God is all perfections, right?
mhm,
God is also absolutely simple, right? God has no
mhm,
parts. So these are two things to keep in mind. And then also, as one becomes holy, one becomes more like God, right?
mhm.
And so this would seem to lend some credence to the theory that becoming more like God makes people more similar.
Mm,
On the other hand, God is also unlimited by nature.
right.
We are limited by nature, which means that no matter how godlike we become, there's always infinitely more room to grow,
Mhm,
right? And so is becoming like God more like we're all down here and God is infinitely high up here. And as we become holier, we converge upward? Or is it more like God is here and we're this tiny little thing in the middle? And as we become more like God, we grow. And as we grow, we get closer to the infinitely far away circumference of the circle and get both larger and farther away from each other.
Yeah.
Not farther away emotionally speaking, because that is clearly not true. The saints, they don't always get along, but they understand each other.
Right.
So is perfection more like one or more like the other? I think is there's probably truth to both of them because these are both images after all, right? These are both images, but there's probably truth to some of them. I think another way to think about it is to think about like, okay, let's say you're working at a fairly large corporation, right? And you got hired at that corporation because you have a particular set of skills, right? And your goal is to become the consummate employee and perhaps even make the most money of anybody in the corporation, right? You're going to have to kind of, in a sense, dividing your time between becoming the best thing you're good at, the thing that you were hired to do, right? Versus developing all the other skills that will help you become successful in the company because the company's more than just you, right? So if you're hired to be a programmer at a company and you want to be the consummate employee, you have to spend a certain amount of time working on, okay, I'm going to be the best programmer I can be. But I'm not going to be the best employee in the company unless I also develop the other skills that I need to work with the people in the other departments that make the whole product work, right? There's a reason that in Dilbert, the pointy-haired boss is the pointy-haired boss and not Alice. Alice is the person in Dilbert who is the best at doing their job in the entire company. I don't think anyone who reads a lot of Dilbert can deny that Alice is the most competent at her job in the entire company. And yet she's not the boss. Why? Because as far as I know, that's the only skill she's got. She's kind of annoying. She gets annoyed with people really easily. She has no patience. She doesn't communicate in a nice way, right? The pointy-haired boss is stupid, but somehow he's managed to gather those other skills that enable him to rise to the pointy-haired top. So if you're looking at like, okay, I want to be a saint, right? Like there's a certain wisdom in like, okay, God made me this way. I want to become the best of that I can be. But at the same time, it's like we live in a society, and that goes spiritually as well as physically. We live in a spiritual society. And, living in that society well is going to impart a certain degree of balance that it would be foolish to avoid. I would say if you look at the saints and you look at maybe St. Thomas Aquinas is maybe one of the ones who's not necessarily known for balance, right? Like he's known for one thing. He's known for writing theology, right? Like that's what he's known for. But at the same time, like you read some of the like spiritual conferences he gave, like things that were lectures meant for the edification of the Dominicans rather than theological works. And they're so easy to read.
Really?
Yeah. His theology is not incredibly hard, is actually not as hard as some other people out there either. But like his spiritual conferences are so easy and so simple, right? Or like you read stories about people who would watch him celebrating mass, right? And like he was, even the traddiest trads at St. Francis wouldn't find anything to complain about with the guy, or like, Dr. K did a wonderful article on St. Thomas Aquinas about a year ago about how he had this just intense devotion to St. Nicholas, right? Who and probably he had that devotion ever since he was a small child and had just held on to it throughout the years, because Saint Nicholas was the patron saint of children, and there seems to be a certain simplicity with which that devotion was expressed. So there's a lot. Like the guy has his specialty, but like he wasn't lacking in other areas either, and so um, it would be foolish to deny out of hand either aspect, even if overall one or the other ends up being more true.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, do we want to circle back to some of those other things
Yes,
you wanted to elaborate on?
I really want to talk about why it makes sense, or why it could make sense to put people in boxes like this.
All right, go for it.
So, you would admit that it makes sense to put dogs and cats into different mental boxes, right?
Mm-hmm.
What actually makes a dog different from a cat?
They have retractable claws.
Okay, great. Cats have retractable claws, right?
Cats are typically much smaller. Actually,
Mhm.
no. If you think of the broad category of cats, cats can actually be much bigger, or at least equal size. I think bears are bigger, but
Yeah, no one calls bears big dogs, but keep going.
well, they're part of the same family, aren't they?
No idea.
Oh, okay. What else is different about cats? They have, well, dogs have whiskers too, don't they?
Oh no, I don't think so.
Really? Okay, then cats have
My
whiskers.
parents are allergic to both, so I'm not exactly
Uh,
a dog and cat expert here.
Cats meow, dogs bark.
Yay. Anyway, so what I'm trying to get at here is we make these divisions of, we would kind of colloquially call this a difference of species, although we'll get into it in a minute why that might not be correct in all senses. But we would call this, we classify these animals based on a lot of, like there's kind of two different schools of thought as to like what makes a dog and a cat different. Okay, so one of those schools of thought is the one that would say something along the lines of, when God makes dogs and cats, he puts a dog soul into the dog and a cat soul into the cat, and they have two different kinds of souls, therefore they are different kinds of animals, right? Then there's the other kind of, and this would say, in technical, Aristotelian philosophical language, you would say, okay, according to this way of thinking, dogs and cats have different substantial forms, right? They have different kinds of substantial forms. Our soul, the human soul, is the human substantial form, to give you kind of an idea of, in a human sense, what kind of thing we're talking about. The other school of thought is that, once again, it's Aristotelian, speaking here, that like, okay, dogs and cats both have animal souls, but the differences between them are they have the same kind of animal soul. So dogs and cats are the same species, according to this way of looking at it, but they have these accidental differences that tend to occur in patterns, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have your dog pattern, you have your cat pattern, and when you named the differences, you were naming the kinds of things that occur in these patterns. Cats meow, dogs bark, cats have retractable claws, dogs don't. You have these things that occur in patterns, and these patterns are stable enough that it's useful for us to classify them like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, to me, if we can classify dogs and cats as different kinds of animals, even if the only thing that makes them different is kind of these regular patterns of small differences, right, that occur in these sets or constellations, for lack of a better word, We can do this with human personalities too. If human personality characteristics occur in predictable patterns, it makes sense to classify humans according to those patterns, even if that's only a tiny part of the human story.
Right.
It's I'm not an animal lover, so I'm perfectly willing to say I think that most personality classifications are far more useful than the difference between dogs and cats. And make about as much sense from a philosophical point of view if you're, holding to the second definition of what makes dogs and cats different.
I think there's probably key medical differences. So your vet can have an easier time treating your favorite family pet as opposed to if there was no classification.
There might be key medical differences between different personalities too. We just haven't gotten far enough along in neurology to discover that yet. And for that, you'd have to interview Dr. Livingston, not myself.
Okay.
And I probably wouldn't be able to follow what he said because I'm, not a neurologist. Did I ever tell you the story of why I didn't become a doctor? Did I ever tell you this story?
I don't think so, no.
This is my favorite story. So when I was probably about 12, my parents invited over this doctor who had been recently divorced, and he'd gotten an annulment. They were trying to set him up with somebody. Okay. And the girl didn't show up. So we went down and watched a movie, and then we had to turn off the movie because it ended up being not appropriate for children. And then this guy just starts talking, right? He was like, oh yeah, medical school. It was great. You'd be dissecting a cadaver with one hand and eating a sandwich with the other. It was great. And I was laying there on the basement floor, and I said to Jesus in what was maybe the first real personal prayer of my life, Jesus, if you come down from heaven in a vision and you tell me with the word of command that I must become a doctor, I might obey you. Otherwise, this will never happen. And he never came down in a vision, and here I am.
Oh my word. So
that would be kind of my philosophical justification for putting people in boxes like that. Then there's the question of like, okay, is it useful? Like, even if it's philosophically valid, does it help us? I think most self-knowledge is generally helpful if it doesn't lead to pride. I do think there's a danger that we can limit ourselves by our personality rather than using it as a starting place to grow. And I think people can do this with the temperaments too. It's just not as common. It's like, oh, sorry, I shouldn't be in charge of this project. I'm a sanguine. Well, grow a little, you sanguine. Oh, I shouldn't put on this party. I'm a melancholic. Well, grow a little, put on the party, like you don't want to limit yourself. And Myers-Briggs too. It's like, oh, I shouldn't take this job that I'm really interested in. I'm a feeler and there's too much science here. It's like, give it a try, I'm not saying you have to take every growth opportunity that comes your way because, you can only do so much. Right. But you see but self-knowledge is a valuable thing. And like, if the philosophical categories are valid, I wouldn't want to write off a particular way of categorizing as, as useless to self-knowledge until it's clearly proven useless. I'm like, well, let's try it. And,
right.
I think Myers-Briggs has got some things going for it. Sorry, therapist. But
well, there's where it gets difficult is if you should try to grow. Oh, I guess it makes sense because knowing who you are knows where you're starting at, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
But then where you want to get to, as you mentioned before, at least in the spiritual sense, you have the circle, and basically you just go in the direction that you're normally pointed in. Or how does that work?
Oh, with the circle?
The circle, yeah, you start in the center, but you're naturally pointed in one direction. And if you keep going
that was just an image to show how it's possible for something to to both grow closer to something that is infinite and absolutely simple, to
Hmm.
become more like that something, and yet become different from other things that are also becoming more like that something.
Hmm.
Like I wasn't trying to describe a route here.
Hmm.
Um,
So
you
can
know,
we talk about your brother Seth's what does he call it? It's something to do with like the Catholic opposite theory, where you have to like become the opposite of your type.
I don't think that that is borne out by how the way the saints' lives work. I think there are saints who have become the opposite of their type. Saint Ignatius of Loyola, I think, being one of the most prominent examples. I
Hmm.
also think there's plenty of saints who stayed true to their type from beginning to end. St. John Paul II and St. Paul, I think, are really notable examples in that category. Um, you know, um, you will find spiritual writers who will talk about, like, for example, I think this is Chesterton, it might be somebody else, talking about how, like, male saints are often really gentle and female saints are often really fierce, right? And while that's true in some cases, it's not true in every case. Like Saint Louis the Ninth is a man and literally led a crusade. Like
Hmm.
he died killing people.
And St. Pius X doesn't exactly strike me as a gentle soul either.
I think he may have grown up as a gentle soul. He might be a little. He might be.
Isn't he the
Yeah.
one who said modernists should be beaten with fists?
Uh, that might have been Pius the Ninth.
Pretty
I'm not
sure.
sure. I don't know enough about Pius X to be able to say if he's on type or not. But like,
Well, he was the farmer. He basically said things as he saw them
he also
and
was a
did.
he also was an amateur composer.
Really?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
That's
Um,
interesting.
Nobody performs anything he wrote because I don't think it was all that good. But like when he writes his encyclical or his whatever you call it on sacred music that the trads love to quote so much, like he is speaking there as someone who knows music. Like
Mhm.
he's not just some person who was told what to say by his theologians. Like this is a pope who actually knew something about the making of music,
Interesting.
in a very personal way, and not just because he read it in a book somewhere. Um, you know, um, so yeah. So I mean, do I think that there are times when God takes people and makes them into their opposite, and that's how they become saints? Yes. Do I think that anyone who wants to be a saint has to be comfortable with being their opposite when it's appropriate? To some degree, yeah. But like, I don't think we can look at all the saints and be like, oh yeah, every saint has this complete 180 from, you know, what they started out as to what they were when they were holy in terms of their personality. Like I don't think that the facts bear that up.
So, is there any virtue in trying to become a type you're not in order to better fit in with your society?
I I mean, I don't think it's a completely useless exercise. I think there's a lot that could go into, is just really the best use of my time. And maybe it is, right?
Hmm.
But I think it also might not be for some people,
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think if you remember my screenplay "Humble Death," it really encapsulates this argument. So, if you remember the protagonist Tannic, uh, he's very much in line with his own tendencies to be a scientist, even though the society said that, you know, basically the psychosis induced by the machines killed our world, and so we have like this suspicion about machinery. But he wants to, he's got like these weather instruments, and one of the things he does is he discovers that there is a gigantic storm on the way, and it's going to wipe out the entire village in 2 days. Well, the whole story is about whether or not Tannic should pursue that, whether or not he should like do something that's separate, because the rest of the society is like they're all farmers. They're mostly
Mhm.
farmers, maybe a blacksmith or two, just really like basic stuff. But he's like this scientist, and he discovers something that can, save the whole community. And the community's like, no, sorry, like you are doing something different from us. Like you're not in line with us. Like we don't want you to be different. And so there's the concept of the humble death, that maybe it's better to just die at your post in a continuity with your community, rather than do something different that could actually save it.
Hmm. Yeah, and I don't remember the details of the story entirely, but like you could make a case there, for example, that like if he would have spent more time developing a winsome personality, for lack of a better word, right, that perhaps his warnings would have been better heeded, right? And so it's like,
But a
okay,
winsome personality is not necessarily something that was part of the social norm. Social norm was everybody farm.
okay,
So
a winsome personality according to the values of the society he's living in.
the values of the society he's living in is that everybody farm and nobody does machines.
Yeah,
So
so
in order to ingratiate himself to the society, he would have to completely forego any kind of like scientific experiments, and therefore not discover the storm, and the storm just kill them all.
right,
Anyway.
so he's in a really unique situation where like what what is the best way for me to contribute to the common good is really complicated, right? And kind of that complication is, for the sake of your story, compressed into this really short span of time, which makes the chasm impossible to cross, right? But like let's kind of extend that into a real world example, right? Where you have someone who's like, okay, I think I could save society 20 years down the road with this idea that I have. Do I spend all my time in my default personality perfecting this idea to make sure it works and hope that someone comes along who can sell my idea to the world so that it actually saves it? Or do I worry less about my default personality, develop in other ways so that I can be that person who sells my idea to the world and saves it, but at the risk of maybe my idea won't actually work, right? Like it's a similar story, but it takes place at like a much longer time span, right? A time span that's maybe more coherent to a human or an actual human life, right? And so like that question of, is it better for me to develop in my own way or develop according to the personality that my society values, becomes kind of unanswerable, because your answer is going to depend on things that you don't know and that you don't have control over.
Hmm. Interesting.
And so like I think this is where, you know, like the virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, faith, hope, and charity, and the gifts of the Holy Spirit are not bound to any one type of personality. And so like especially that gift of prudence, right, or that virtue of prudence, right, and infused wisdom from the Holy Spirit, which is completely beyond our control. Like
Mhm.
these two things are going to serve us much better in terms of becoming the kind of person we're supposed to be, rather than like trying to answer these questions ahead of time. Like this is the prime example of a question that it's like it's better to ask the question than to answer it.
Hmm.
Like there's a certain type of teacher who like wants you to ask the right questions and doesn't really want you to answer them.
That sounds like my
and
kind of teacher.
and like certain kinds of people I think like to give those kinds of teachers a bad rap, but this is what they are for. Like this is the kind of situation that kind of teacher is exactly the kind of person who you want, you know, who you want to be turning to for those kinds of advice.
Indeed, indeed.
So I'm not. So basically, I'm not going to answer your question. You go talk to your spiritual director, or you know, you know, trust in God a little bit. You know, like you don't have to know the answer to this question. Like it's good to ask, but you do not have to know what the answer is. You will be just fine not knowing.
Or maybe the answer is different depending on the situation.
Right, but I can't tell you unless I have every detail of the situation that you can give me, and the situation isn't even real. Like the particular situation that we were describing is a hypothetical.
Hmm.
We can fill in the details how we want. So like, you know,
Right.
so yeah, yeah. Anyway,
Well, on that note, we have been going for about 2 hours strong.
there was one more question that you had for me that we did not get to.
Oh yes. Do you think that unique? Well, I think you kind of already answered it, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you think that uniqueness is under attack in our world today, or is it overemphasized?
I think uniqueness is. I would say that uniqueness is emphasized in certain areas of our society, and it's under attack in others.
Mm,
Um, and I don't know if that's like how it like I don't know if a more uniform solution would be better. Like for example, in schools there's so much attention paid to like different learning styles, different learning disabilities, different kinds of accommodations, right? And like it is such a good acknowledgement that people are unique, and it's really great. And I think on the whole, it helps people quite a bit. It's also really hard to do well for the teachers. Like it is a
yeah.
lot of work. And is it worth it? Is a whole other conversation. And are there better solutions that we don't try because they're not egalitarian for us
Talk about
enough for
homeschooling.
us? Well, I was thinking more like you send the kids with all the kids with the same learning disability to the same school.
Oh yeah. That would be that would be a pretty well. Doesn't that
Yeah,
happen in some places? There's like special needs schools.
yeah, but it's not the default solution.
Hmm.
Um, it's kind of a special situation solution. So like that's an area in which uniqueness, I would say, is very much prized, right?
Hmm.
And in a way that is probably more helpful than not, right? Um, I also think that a lot of people are scared by people who are some people are scared by people who are different from them and behave accordingly, um, and they wouldn't even be able to describe that that's what they're doing, but they do it. um, and I think that's also something that in some respects is better, I think from what I have observed, comparing young people now to what people were like when we were growing up, I feel like people are a lot better at not reacting with fear when someone is different, but I don't know if they've gotten better to reacting well when someone behaves different on purpose.
Mm,
Um, so like, so like someone who's, yeah, someone who's different by conviction, for lack of a better word. I don't know if they've really improved on dealing with that, as opposed to someone who's different by disposition,
hmm.
um, even if that disposition was in some way chosen, you know, which I don't want to be the one who decides when that is and when it isn't, right? But if there seems to be some dispositional element to it, people seem very comfortable with that in a good way.
Right.
Um, but when it's chosen, and not by disposition, that doesn't seem to have gotten any better in 35 years.
Well, that is a complicated subject full of landmines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think personality's in kind of this weird spot, I think, too, where if people don't understand what they're working with, they're not gonna know what box to put it in, for lack of a better word, and so they're not going to be comfortable with it. But once they can name it, they're fine, I think.
Right.
And then there's the whole workplace thing of a workplace may really want you to be a certain type of personality. I think that's a very real thing. But, I think the pressures are very workplace specific or job specific rather than, society-wide trends.
Yep. There are no jobs for INFJs.
I don't know if I agree with that. You just
okay, maybe there's two.
What would the two be?
I don't know. Writer and therapist.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. That is what the stereotype says now, isn't it?
That's what the stereotype says. Yes. Although I know someone who's probably an INFJ who owns a marketing company.
Oh, nice.
So, all right. Well, thanks for that fascinating conversation, Father.
Welcome. Hopefully, I don't get in trouble with anybody over this.
Oh well, that's the nature of the beast of being in public. Is there's always somebody around the corner who's going to yell at you, no matter what you say.
Yeah, I got permission to do this from the proper people, so
Well, there you go. I'm glad you did. So, all right. Well, thanks again. And until next time.
All right. Thanks. See you later.